Long before the first European sails appeared on the horizon, long before the names Florida or America, the Floridian peninsula was home to countless generations of people. They hunted, fished, built villages, and raised children there for over 12,000 years. This is the story of Florida's first peoples, from the Ice Age hunters of the Pleistocene to the mound builders of the late Mississippian world. When humans first arrived in Florida 14,500 years ago, the land was almost unrecognizable. It is impossible to know what these early peoples called themselves, so archaeologists generally refer to them as Paleoindians. Sea levels were more than 100 feet lower than today due to the ongoing ice age, which trapped massive amounts of seawater in ice. The climate in Florida during this time was cool and arid, like an African savanna. Many of the lakes, springs, wetlands, and rivers we know today did not exist. Water was in short supply. This different kind of geography and climate meant a different array of animals and plants. Giants such as mammoths and giant sloths roamed the grass prairies. Water holes such as warm mineral springs became vital to animals for drinking water in this dry environment. Humans also relied heavily on these few watering holes, not only for drinking water, but also for campsites where animals could be ambushed, butchered, and eaten. Evidence of these campsites are found today at the bottom of rivers, such as Osceola River in North Florida, and sinkholes, such as Warm Mineral Springs and Little Salt Springs in Sarasota County. Sarasota County has a rare archaeological gem with the Warm Mineral Springs Archaeological Site because it has provided researchers with a wealth of information about the ways of life of the Paleoindians of Florida. Between Venice and Northport, Warm Mineral Springs is located about 1 mile north of US 41 and 2 miles east of Miyaka River. This underwater site has yielded unprecedented information about the Paleoindians in Florida and their environment. The surface of the spring is a round pond, about 230 feet wide. Beneath the surface, the spring extends down 200 feet and is shaped like an hourglass. At about 45 feet below the surface are small ledges, like the sides of an hourglass, that come inward. Underwater explorations began in the late 1950s by retired Lieutenant Colonel William Royal. Royal, with the help of biologist Eugenie Clark, reported the discovery of several human skulls and other human bone fragments from the ledge area. One of the skull fragments contained the first human brain material found in Florida. In 1972, Carl Clausen, an underwater archaeologist with the state of Florida, investigated the shallow ledges and caves 45 feet below the surface. Clausen recovered human bone, charred wood, and leaf deposits which date from about 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. Later in 1973, W.A. Sonny Cockrell, an underwater archaeologist with Florida State University, recovered several fragments of human bone, as well as small animal bones and preserved oak and hickory nuts. To find such fragile artifacts in such a pristine state of preservation was extraordinary. Cockrell attributed the remarkable preservation to the lack of oxygen in the water. Other artifacts recovered from the ledges and debris cone include bone tools, shell tools, and bone fragments from such animals as the saber-toothed cat, panther, and turtle. During the Paleoindian period, the Gulf of Mexico's shoreline stretched far beyond the modern coast. Sites like Page-Ladson give us a window into this distant time. There, archaeologists discovered butchered mastodon bones. Nearby, fluted Clovis spear points were found, chipped from stone, and used with wooden shafts to hunt Ice Age animals. The Paleoindians were expert tool makers and hunters, moving in small bands across vast distances in search of game and fresh water. They left behind camps at places like Silver Springs and the Suwannee River, where their distinctive stone tools still lie buried beneath layers of sediment. But the world around them was changing fast. As the Ice Age ended and the glaciers melted, the sea began to rise. Florida's coastline crept inland, drowning ancient hunting grounds. The last ice age ended about 12,000 years ago, which is also when the first humans began to move down the peninsula. They were hunter-gatherers who moved from place to place, searching for food and fresh water. At that time, Florida had little rainfall, so fresh water was difficult to find. They lived a simple life, following the great herds of mammoths and other megafauna, and gathered the wild grains, nuts, and berries they found in their seasonal wanderings. They made no pottery, used no bows and arrows. Instead, they hunted with spears and cooked in leather bags, heating the contents with hot stones. By about 8000 BC, the mammoths and mastodons were gone. The great Ice Age hunters had to adapt, or vanish. Until recently, the Middle Archaic period of 8,000 to 5,000 years ago was regarded by archaeologists as a time of small and mobile hunter-gatherer populations whose cultural differences could be explained by local environmental conditions. While environmental changes during this interval were indeed dramatic and consequential to humans, recent evidence from Middle Archaic sites across the southeast, as well as northeast Florida, call into question many of our simplistic notions about this fascinating time period. In the wake of a post-glacial era that witnessed burgeoning human populations across the region, environmental conditions in certain locations became increasingly drier and hotter. In the lower Midwest and Mid-South, for instance, a drier and warmer climate appears to have reduced the viability of upland habitat to support groups that had come to depend on mast, deer, and turkey resources for the winter. At the same time, riverine habitats appear to have improved as increased runoff from desiccated uplands enhanced the food potential of major river valleys. Patterns of regional settlement suggest that certain groups responded to these changes by intensifying the use of riverine locations. In some cases, the change may have entailed permanent settlement of riverine sites. In others, use of such sites was simply more redundant and intensive than before. Changes in coastal habitats appear to have precipitated parallel developments. Sea levels rose rapidly after the Ice Age, slowing only after about 6,000 years ago. Because rising seas have inundated the once exposed coastal sites of Middle Archaic populations, we can only speculate on the human responses to environmental change. Still, enough evidence has now accumulated to suggest that relatively permanent use of the coast took place by at least the end of the Middle Archaic period, if not centuries before. Some of the shell middens and shell rings of the Atlantic and Gulf coasts were initiated during the Middle Archaic and reflect intensive use of estuary resources. Not all Middle Archaic populations were on the pathway toward more permanent or redundant land use. Groups occupying the Piedmont of Georgia and the Carolinas appear to have actually increased their level of settlement mobility. The small size of their sites, coupled with evidence for simple, portable technology and generalized foodways, suggests a pattern of foraging quite different from riverine and coastal patterns. Whereas this difference has been attributed to local environmental conditions alone, other archaeologists have noted that interactions among regional populations may have contributed to differentiation in life ways. Cultural diversity and group interactions have become defining themes in recent research on the Middle Archaic period. Some of the new evidence for elaborate cultural expressions is indeed compelling. In northeast Louisiana, for instance, archaeologists have discovered that some of the region's many earthen mounds date to at least 5,500 years ago. Several of these sites include mounds arranged in elliptical fashion around a central plaza area and are reminiscent of the settlement plans of relatively complex societies. In the Mid-South, archaeologists have documented an interaction network centered on the production of elaborate flake stone tools. Although inconclusive, the evidence for trade appears to be linked to mortuary ritual, perhaps veneration for ancestors of special rank or significance. A similar network of exchange has been documented at Middle Archaic sites in the lower Midwest, this one involving the production of elaborately carved bone pins. Florida's Middle Archaic record is just as fascinating and includes evidence for mound building, mortuary ritual, and long-distance exchange. Tomoka Mounds near Cape Canaveral and Tick Island on the St. Johns River are among the locations of mound construction dating to the Mount Taylor period, 5,500 years ago. Shell mounds on Tick Island were largely destroyed in the early 1950s when they were mined for construction fill. When C.B. Moore visited the island in 1891, some of its mounds towered 20 or more feet above the river. Salvage excavations in 1961 confirmed that some of the mounds were initiated as mortuary monuments, as burials were decidedly concentrated at the base of the deposit. Tomoka mounds lack evidence for mortuary functions, but contain artifacts imported from far away, including a cache of 6 banner stones made on materials whose sources lie no closer than North Georgia. The Lake Monroe site encapsulates many of these key issues in its unusual mix of well-preserved subsistence data and elaborate material culture. Faunal remains from Lake Monroe suggest that the site was occupied most of the year, but conclusive evidence for permanent settlement remains elusive. Data from slightly later period sites on the St. Johns have been equally ambiguous with regards to year-round habitation. Although almost certainly by about 3,500 years ago, the region was home to separate, relatively stationary groups on the coast and along the river. Middle Archaic use of marine shell at the Lake Monroe site adds a new twist to the ongoing inquiry into regional settlement. The assemblage of whelk and oyster shells recovered from Lake Monroe is unprecedented for an early riverine site. Being some 40 kilometers from its source, the shell was either carried in directly from the coast or imported through coastal neighbors. Moreover, the materials used to make the drills for producing beads was also non-local, coming from sources to the west. Thus, the entire production process depended on materials that had to be acquired from afar. Although this fact alone does not resolve whether riverine settlement was permanent or seasonal, the geographic scope of exchange suggests Middle Archaic groups across northeast Florida were indeed culturally divided in ways that both enabled and regulated flows of personnel and resources among interior, riverine, and coastal populations. Our understanding of these diverse groups thus depends as much on the nature of interactions among them as it does on their respective relations to different environmental settings. In this new, warmer world, Florida began to take on its familiar shape, with wetlands, cypress swamps, pine forests, and barrier islands. New technologies entered the lives of the people. They found that spears could be thrown farther and with much more power and accuracy with the use of an atlatl, a stick that was fitted into the shaft of a spear. People turned to the vast water resources. Fish, shellfish, turtles, and alligators became major parts of their diet. Hollowed-out log canoes enabled them to travel the many rivers. Another important technological invention was pottery. The type created in this time was a soft and porous pottery. This pottery was tempered with a substance that burned away as the pottery was fired. The descendants of the Paleoindians then entered what archaeologists call the Archaic period. They no longer followed herds across the plains. Instead, they settled near rivers, lakes, and estuaries, places rich in fish, shellfish, and plants. Archaic peoples became skilled at exploiting the environment year-round. They invented ground stone tools and nets. They began to bury their dead in ponds, leaving behind remarkable sites like the Windover Bog, near Titusville. At Windover, archaeologists uncovered over 160 well-preserved skeletons, dating back more than 7,000 years, some of the oldest human remains in North America. DNA and artifacts from the site reveal that these people wove textiles, crafted wooden tools, and even buried their dead with personal belongings, a sign of emerging spiritual beliefs and community identity. The Archaic peoples also witnessed the birth of Florida's wetlands culture, a deep connection to river, springs, and the sea that would define Florida's future civilizations. Over thousands of years, populations grew. Trade networks began to form, linking Florida to the broader southeast. Exotic stone, copper, and shells moved between the communities hundreds of miles apart. The people were becoming more sedentary, villages grew larger, and the first experiments in mound building began. Around 3,000 years ago, the archaic world transitioned into something new, a period archaeologists call the Woodland era. The Orange culture, along the northeast coast, made simple, fiber-tempered pottery, the earliest known in North America. From about 4,000 years ago to about 2,500 or 3,000 years ago, the Orange culture was a late archaic archaeological culture that thrived along the eastern side of the Florida peninsula. The Orange period is largely defined by the presence of Orange series fiber-tempered pottery. During the middle to late Archaic period, sea level rise slowed and approached contemporary levels. Barrier islands and lagoons formed along much of the coast of Florida, and the gradient of the St. Johns River decreased, creating a string of wetlands in its valleys. Relatively large sedentary populations exploited the resources of these new coastal and riverine wetlands in Florida, while drier regions were only lightly exploited. Distinguishable regional culture varieties began developing in the wetland areas. The pre-ceramic Mount Taylor period emerged along the east coast of Florida and in the drainage of the St. Johns River around 5000 to 4000 BC. Fiber-tempered pottery, which had developed in the Stallings culture area of Georgia and South Carolina around 2500 BC, appeared in Florida around 2000 BC, marking the beginning of the Orange period. The Orange culture extended throughout the St. Johns River watershed and along the Florida coast from north of the mouth of the St. Johns River to the vicinity of Sebastian, Florida. After about 1,000 to 1,500 years, the Orange culture developed into the St. John's culture. The Mount Taylor period is characterized by a lack of ceramics, while the Orange period is characterized by the presence of fiber-tempered ceramics, and the St. John's period is characterized by the presence of sand-tempered ceramics. Communities like those at Crystal River, Turtle Mound, and Lake Jackson began constructing large earthen mounds, some for burials and others for ceremonies or marking sacred spaces. At Crystal River, towering shell and sand mounds overlooked the Gulf, built over centuries by people who left behind exquisite copper ornaments and stone effigies, signs of long-distance trade with the cultures of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. By this time, Florida was no longer isolated. It was part of a continent-wide web of exchange, a world where trade goods, ideas, and beliefs moved through vast river networks and coastal routes. These communities practiced early forms of horticulture, tending gourds, squash, and native plants while still relying heavily on hunting and fishing. Populations stabilized, and people began to identify more strongly with their territories. Tribal homelands that would later give rise to distinct regional cultures. By around 800 AD, Florida's societies had grown increasingly complex. Distinct cultures emerged across the peninsula and the Panhandle, each adapted to its environment. In the north around Tallahassee and the Appalachia region, villages grew into powerful chiefdoms, influenced by the great Mississippian civilizations to the north, cultures like Cahokia, whose monumental mounds and ceremonial plazas shaped the entire southeast. The Lake Jackson site, near modern Tallahassee, became one of the most important ceremonial centers in Florida. Its great platform mounds and carefully arranged burials show clear ties to Mississippian religious and political traditions. The people here, ancestors to the Appalachia, cultivated maize, beans, and squash, and organized themselves into hierarchical societies ruled by powerful chiefs. Farther south, other peoples followed different paths. Along the Gulf Coast, the Weeden Island and later Safety Harbor cultures flourished. The Safety Harbor people, who lived near today's Tampa Bay, built large temple mounds, practiced elaborate mortuary rituals, and crafted finely made pottery and shell tools. On the Atlantic side, the St. John's culture thrived along the rivers and lagoons, and were noted for their distinctive chalky pottery and massive shell middens. Some stretching hundreds of feet long, silent monuments of daily life centered around fishing, gathering, and ceremony. In the far south, the Calusa built a maritime empire unlike anything else in North America. They did not farm. Instead, they ruled the coasts and estuaries through fishing, canoe building, and trade. The Calusa constructed vast shell mounds and engineered canals through the 10,000 islands. Their capital at Mount Key in Estero Bay was a city built almost entirely from shells. Spanish explorers would later describe the Calusa as fierce and organized, ruled by kings and priests, a civilization forged from the sea itself. The Calusa people were a politically complex and powerful Native American civilization in southwest Florida that uniquely built its society on estuary fisheries. They resisted European colonization for centuries before being decimated by diseases and warfare in the 1700s. Unlike many other hunter-gatherer societies, the Calusa developed a complex, stratified social and political framework. Their society was led by a chiefly elite that included a king, a military leader, and a chief priest. The Calusa were expert fishermen relying on the sea for sustenance. They harvested fish and shellfish using complex water management systems, including canals and engineered watercourts to trap large quantities of fish. They were skilled craftspeople, known for producing finely carved wooden masks, ornaments, and sculptures. They also used shells to create tools, utensils, and jewelry, earning them the nickname the Shell Indians. The Calusa built massive shell mounds, some over 30 feet tall, which served as foundations for their villages, ceremonial centers, and defenses. Their homes were chickees, or elevated open-sided dwellings, with palmetto-thatched roofs. Their religion was based on animism, with a belief in 3 souls for each person. They held ceremonies featuring masked processions and resisted Spanish attempts at conversion for 200 years. At their peak, the Calusa controlled most of southern Florida, including influence over other tribes such as the Maimi and Tequesta. Their population was estimated to be as high as 50,000. Early Spanish explorers like Juan de Leon were met with fierce resistance from Calusa. De Leon was fatally wounded in a conflict with the Calusa in 1521. Using dugout canoes from hollowed-out cypress logs, the Calusa developed an extensive trade network that stretched as far as Cuba. They also salvaged goods from Spanish shipwrecks. Across prehistoric Florida, life was deeply tied to the environment. Communities developed specialized crafts, carving bone and shell into fish hooks, beads, and tools, weaving fibers into nets and mats, and trading shell ornaments as far north as the Tennessee Valley. Around 1,200 years ago, a major innovation spread across the region, the bow and arrow. It replaced the atlatl in most of Florida, transforming hunting and warfare. Smaller triangular projectile points, easily recognized by archaeologists, mark this change in the archaeological record. With these new weapons came new dynamics: territorial defense, intervillage conflict, and shifts in leadership. Chiefs and elites began to command not just through tradition, but through organized power. Yet daily life remained grounded in family and community. Fires crackled beneath palmetto-thatched roofs. Children played along riverbanks. Elders told stories of creation and ancestors, stories tied to the same stars and waterways that shaped their world. By the late 1400s, on the eve of European arrival, Florida was home to a mosaic of thriving native cultures, each with its own language, art, and belief systems. In the north, the Appalachee presided over rich farmland and mound centers. Along the Gulf, the Safety Harbor chiefdom dominated Tampa Bay. To the east, the Timucua peoples lived along the lagoons and rivers. And in the far south, the Calusa ruled the coastal waters like kings. Despite their initial resistance, the Calusa population was decimated by European diseases like smallpox and measles, to which they had no immunity. English allied Creek and Yamasee raiders, equipped with firearms, conducted slave raids in the early 1700s that ultimately destroyed the surviving Calusa population. By the late 1700s, the remaining Calusa had largely disappeared as a distinct group. Some assimilated into other tribes like the Seminoles, while others fled to Cuba. As a result, the Calusa language was lost. Today, the Calusa legacy endures through archaeological sites like Mount Key and the presence of their place names, such as the Caloosahatchee River in modern Florida. For thousands of years, the Indians of Florida had endured and adapted through rising seas, shifting climates, and the passage of millennia. They were not static tribes, frozen in time, but dynamic, evolving cultures with histories as deep and complex as those of any civilization on Earth. However, foreign diseases, trade goods, and weapons would spread faster than anyone could imagine. Within a few generations, Florida's ancient world, 12,000 years of human history, would be changed forever. But before that contact, before the upheaval and collapse, Florida's peoples stood at the height of their achievement, masters of their environment, connected by trade and faith, living lives shaped by water, earth, and sky. This was ancient Florida, a world of mounds and marshes, hunters and fishermen, builders and dreamers whose legacy lives on. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed my documentary, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/World Chronicles.